We begin, though, with the latest on a possible peace deal. President Trump now says no American troops will be deployed to Ukraine as he continues to push for a face-to-face meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Trump is promising to provide additional security guarantees to Ukraine, but hasn't specified what that would entail. Now, this follows that meeting with European leaders and President Zelenskyy at the White House on Monday. The president says the European allies will front-load the assistance, with several willing to put boots on the ground as part of those guarantees. And as President Trump presses Putin to sit down for additional talks, CBS News senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams has more on why some Ukrainians are skeptical if the Russian president really wants peace in the region.
For many Ukrainians, it's difficult to believe that Vladimir Putin really wants peace. Just yesterday, a swarm of Russian drones killed at least 5 people in an apartment complex in the city of Kharkiv, according to Ukrainian officials. One of those killed was a baby girl who rescue workers tried desperately to resuscitate, but she didn't make it. Now, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has survived nearly 3.5 years of war as Ukraine's leader, but he may now face his biggest challenge yet. If Zelenskyy makes territorial concessions as part of a peace deal that is permanently giving parts of Ukraine to Russia, some here will see that as weak or foolish. Ukrainians know that international agreements have failed to protect their country in the past. But if Zelenskyy doesn't make concessions, he risks alienating President Trump again, as he did back in February at that contentious meeting at the White House. None of the players can afford to simply reject President Trump's efforts and his optimism. That would be political and diplomatic suicide. But Vladimir Putin's forces currently have the upper hand on the battlefield. So many in Ukraine and Europe think it's unlikely he really wants to end the war. Holly Williams, CBS News, Kyiv, Ukraine.
Holly Williams, thank you. And the White House is praising what the administration considers a successful round of discussions on Monday. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt addressed yesterday's meeting and the next steps for another round of peace talks.
Following the encouraging conversations yesterday, President Trump spoke with President Putin by phone, and he agreed to begin the next phase of the peace process, a meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy, which would be followed, if necessary, by a trilateral meeting between President Putin, President Zelenskyy, and President Trump.
For more on this, let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Olivia, great to have you with us. You hear about this possible trilat meeting. What's the latest on it between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia? And what's the likelihood of this actually happening?
Well, Nancy, that's the goal right now, is just to get a date on the table. I asked Ukrainian President Zelenskyy about this yesterday, whether or not they had picked a date for the two of them to meet or a location. He said no date had been set, no location had been set, but the first step has been made, which is that both sides have now seemingly agreed to meet, those both sides being President Putin of Russia and President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. Now the goal for the White House is to really figure out where they can do this meeting and the parameters of the discussion. We know yesterday President Zelenskyy had said they're not going to discuss territory, or that he wouldn't discuss territory with European leaders and the U.S. He would save that conversation for his meeting with Putin. Now, on the aspect of it being a trilateral meeting versus a bilateral meeting, also a question, because President Trump said yesterday, if you don't need me there, I don't have to be there, to which President Zelenskyy looked at him and said, we'd like to have you there, please. President Trump then said, sure, I'll be there. But the idea that was proposed, at least by President Putin on that phone call with President Trump yesterday, was first it would be a bilateral meeting between him and Zelenskyy, and then, if needed, would become a trilateral meeting. So we're watching out for the next couple of days to see whether or not there is a date announced, a location announced, and if President Trump will indeed go.
So also, Olivia, one of the sticking points here seems to be those security guarantees, the president vowing to provide security assistance to Ukraine, but also doesn't seem to think a ceasefire is necessary to end the war. What is the thinking behind that? And on the flip side, why do Ukraine and these European leaders feel a ceasefire is essential in order to obtain a peace deal?
Well, this is actually an interesting thing we learned yesterday from President Trump as to why he doesn't think a ceasefire is necessary. Because, of course, going into his meeting with President Putin, he said he wanted a ceasefire on the table. After he met with Putin last week in in Anchorage in Alaska, he then said, I don't think a ceasefire is necessary. And yesterday he said the reason why he thinks that is because he says he's been able to end other wars, other conflicts around the globe without getting a ceasefire in place. And he believes if you have that ceasefire, on the one hand, it stops killing, but on the other hand, it can give time for the armies to regroup and attack and continue the fighting. So because of that, he's against the ceasefire. Now, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has said there's no way he can go to the negotiating table with Moscow unless there's a ceasefire, because they have continued to bombard Ukraine and all of their cities, including civilians, and killing civilians overnight. And we heard from German Chancellor Merz yesterday at the table with President Trump saying he thinks this is necessary and that they should at least try to get something on the table before they go into this meeting. So clearly something that still needs to be hammered out between these sides. But for right now, the White House is saying they don't think it's necessary.
And Olivia, on another point, the president now vowing to issue an executive order banning the use of mail-in ballots as well as voting machines ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. So what is the legality of an order like that? Can he actually do this? And we should also mention Republicans, they actually had success with mail-in voting back in 2024. So why make this switch now?
Well, it's an excellent point. They certainly did have success with it. And just as someone who covered that campaign, I can tell you there was a campaign within the campaign to get President Trump on board with mail-in voting. It was something they sat down with him and talked about and said, look, this helps you. This helps you. If Republicans vote early and by mail, we can bank these votes and therefore have a bigger, swath of votes going into Election Day that are for Republicans. Seemingly, the president got on board during the 2024 campaign and agreed with it. But again, after that meeting with President Putin in Russia last week, suddenly changed his tone about it once more, saying that he believes they are fraudulent, and he says he's going to be signing this executive order to get rid of mail-in voting. However, a lot of this is actually just up to the states. States make their own voting laws. States make their laws about whether they accept mail-in voting, when they accept it by. Certainly there can be legal challenges by the White House, lawsuits over some of those mail-in voting rules. And certainly the president did this during 2020, during that election. We saw how that all played out in the court. So, Nancy, we'll have to see whether or not he moves forward with signing that executive order.
All right, Olivia and Rinaldi, thank you very much for being with us.